The Mauser Kar-98K was more than a rifle. It was an extension of the German will to conquer. Precise, rugged, and forged in the fires of European tradition, it served as the backbone of the Wehrmacht's infantry doctrine. German soldiers trusted its bolt-action mechanism with their lives, believing that a single well-placed shot was the ultimate arbiter of battle. But in the chaotic hedgerows of Normandy and the jagged hills of Italy, this adherence to tradition collided violently with the cold efficiency of American industrial might. The German sniper, hidden in the foliage, peered through his scope and saw an enemy he believed to be undisciplined and over-equipped. He laughed at the bulky, semi-automatic rifle the Americans carried, convinced that rapid fire was a crutch for poor marksmanship. He was wrong. In this war, battles were won not just by bullets, but by logistics and the relentless tempo of fire. Now let us return to the blood-soaked fields of the European theater, where a technological revolution was about to silence the skeptics. To understand the arrogance of the German infantrymen in the early stages of the American intervention, one had to understand his weapon. The Mauser system was a masterpiece of 19th-century engineering. It required a deliberate rhythmic interaction between man and machine. To fire, the soldier lifted the bolt handle, pulled it back to eject the spent casing, pushed it forward to strip a new round from the magazine, and locked it down to seal the chamber. It was a physical cadence that demanded discipline. It forced the shooter to break his sight picture, even if only for a fraction of a second, and reset his aim. This rhythm dictated the pace of German infantry tactics. The rifleman existed primarily to support the machine gun, the MG-34 or the terrifying MG-42, which laid down the volume of fire while the rifleman picked off suppressed targets with calm precision. Because of this doctrine, the German military establishment viewed the individual rifleman as a precision instrument, not a volume fire asset. When intelligence reports first trickled back to Berlin regarding the standard-issue rifle of the United States forces, the reaction was dismissive. The M1 Garand was heavy, weighing nearly 10 pounds when fully loaded. It was complex, filled with gas cylinders, operating rods, and springs that the German High Command insisted would jam in the mud of the battlefield. But most of all, it was semi-automatic. To the Prussian mindset, a standard infantry rifle that fired as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger was a waste of ammunition. They believed it would encourage soldiers to spray and pray rather than aim. They believed the Americans would run dry of ammunition in minutes, leaving them vulnerable to the disciplined fire of the Mauser. This dismissal filtered down to the frontline troops. Snipers, the elite predators of the Wehrmacht, felt a particular sense of superiority. A German sniper, concealed in a bell tower or a dense thicket, operated with the patience of a hunter. He knew that after he took a shot, the bolt-action report was a singular event. He could fire, cycle the bolt, and wait. He expected his enemy to be armed similarly. If he faced British troops with their Lee Enfields or Russians with their Mosin Nagants, the rhythm of the firefight was predictable. There was a pause between shots. There was a tempo that a skilled soldier could exploit. When the Americans arrived in force, however, they brought with them a weapon that defied the established rhythm of war. The M1 Garand was the first standard-issue semi-automatic rifle to be fielded by a major power. It was a marvel of mass production, a weapon that turned every individual rifleman into a pocket of suppressive fire. The American soldier did not have to lift a bolt. He did not have to break his cheek weld. He simply lined up the sights and squeezed the trigger. The gas from the fired cartridge cycled the action, ejecting the brass and loading the next round faster than the eye could follow. The first encounters were shocking for the Wehrmacht veterans. A German squad might engage an American patrol, expecting the slow, deliberate return fire typical of bolt-action units. Instead, they were met with a wall of lead. An American squad of 12 men could unleash a volume of fire that rivaled a machine gun nest, all while maneuvering and closing the distance. The German sniper who revealed his position with a single shot did not receive a single return shot in answer. He received 8 rounds in rapid succession, tearing through the cover he thought was secure. Yet, old habits died hard. The initial shock was often rationalized away by German officers as American wastefulness. They looked at the piles of spent brass left behind by advancing U.S. troops and scoffed. "Look how they waste metal," they would say. "They fire at ghosts." This arrogance persisted, even as the front lines collapsed backward toward the Reich. The German soldier, trained to value the single shot, could not immediately grasp that the philosophy of infantry combat had fundamentally shifted. The era of the bolt-action rifle, which had dominated warfare for half a century, was ending not with a whimper, but with the roar of gas-operated actions. The M1 Garand was not just a gun, it was a statement of industrial capability. It represented a nation that could afford to equip millions of men with a weapon that demanded precise machining and high-quality steel. While Germany was forced to simplify its manufacturing processes, stamping out sheet metal weapons to save resources, the United States poured its industrial soul into a rifle that offered its soldiers a distinct tactical advantage. The German sniper, looking through his Zeiss scope, saw the wooden stock and the gas tube of the Garand and smiled, thinking he held the advantage of precision. He did not yet realize that the man in his crosshairs could fire 8 rounds in the time it took him to fire 2. He did not yet know that the distinct metallic ping of the en-bloc clip, a sound he would soon come to listen for with desperate intensity, would become the soundtrack of his defeat. The laughter in the German ranks was genuine in those early days, born of a deep-seated belief in their own martial superiority. They did not know that the instrument of their doom was already in the hands of the enemy, waiting for the bolt to drop. Long before the first American boot touched the sands of North Africa or the shingle of Omaha Beach, the battle for the M1 Garand was fought in the drafting rooms and machine shops of the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. It was a silent war of inches, springs, and tolerances, waged against the inertia of tradition and the sting of the Great Depression. The mastermind behind this revolution was not a decorated general or a combat veteran, but a quiet, unassuming French-Canadian immigrant named John Cantius Garand. He possessed a mind that saw machinery not as static metal, but as a fluid series of events. While the rest of the world was content with the bolt-action rifles that had defined the previous World War, Garand was obsessed with the concept of semi-automatic fire. His vision, however, was met with profound skepticism by the United States Army Ordnance Department. In the 1920s and early 1930s, the American military establishment was dominated by officers who had cut their teeth in the trenches of France. To them, the bolt-action M1903 Springfield was perfection. It was accurate, reliable, and encouraged disciplined marksmanship. The old guard viewed the very idea of a standard-issue semi-automatic rifle with deep suspicion. They argued that such a weapon would be too heavy for the average doughboy to carry on long marches. They claimed the mechanism would be too fragile to withstand the mud and grit of the battlefield. But their most fervent argument was economic and psychological. They believed that if you gave a soldier a gun that fired as fast as he could pull the trigger, he would panic and waste his ammunition in seconds. Garand labored against this wall of doubt for nearly 2 decades. His challenge was not merely to build a gun that worked. He had to build a gun that could survive the impossible standards of the U.S. Army. The engineering hurdles were immense. Early prototypes relied on a primer-actuated system, which proved unsuitable. Garand shifted to a gas-operated system, tapping the expanding gases of the fired bullet to drive a piston and cycle the action. It was a brilliant solution, but it required high-grade steel and precision machining that taxed the capabilities of the era. The greatest threat to the Garand rifle, however, came not from engineering failure, but from logistical pragmatism. In the early 1930s, the Army had seriously considered adopting a smaller, lighter caliber, the .276 Peterson. Garand had designed his rifle around this efficient new cartridge, and the results were spectacular. The weapon was lighter, had less recoil, and held 10 rounds. It seemed poised for adoption. But the shadow of the Great Depression loomed over the War Department. The Army sat upon a stockpile of millions of rounds of .30-06 ammunition left over from the First World War. General Douglas MacArthur, then Chief of Staff of the Army, looked at the budget and the stockpiles and made a command decision. He ordered that the new service rifle must be chambered in the old, powerful .30-06 cartridge. For a lesser engineer, this mandate might have been the end. The .30-06 was a violent, high-pressure round, far more difficult to tame in a semi-automatic action than the .276. Garand essentially had to scrap years of work and redesign the rifle to handle the punishing recoil and pressure of the larger caliber. He returned to his drawing board at Springfield, working through the complexities of the gas system. He designed a robust rotating bolt that locked into the receiver with a strength that rivaled the bolt-action rifles the generals loved so much. He engineered a receiver that could take a beating and keep functioning. One of the most controversial design choices, and the one that would become legendary, was the feeding system. Most modern engineers would have opted for a detachable box magazine, similar to the Thompson submachine gun or the later M1 carbine. But the Ordnance Department had a peculiar fear. They believed soldiers in the heat of battle would drop and lose detachable magazines, rendering the weapon useless. To appease this concern, Garand utilized the en-bloc clip system. This stamped metal clip held 8 rounds of ammunition and was inserted directly into the rifle's internal magazine. It was a compromise born of military bureaucracy, yet it created a unique manual of arms. The clip stayed inside the gun until the last round was fired, at which point the mechanism would eject the empty clip and lock the bolt open, ready for the next load. By 1936, the rifle was officially adopted as the U.S. Rifle Caliber 30, M1. But adoption did not mean acceptance. As production ramped up, problems arose. The early gas trap systems collected carbon and fouled easily. Barrels overheated. The skepticism of the infantry officers seemed vindicated. "See?" they whispered in the mess halls. "It's a delicate toy. It won't last in a real war." Garand and the production engineers at Springfield did not falter. They redesigned the gas system into a simpler gas port design, drilling a hole directly into the barrel. They tweaked the heat treating. They refined the manufacturing process until the M1 Garand was no longer a prototype, but a mass-producible reality. By the time the dark clouds of war gathered over Europe and the Pacific, the United States had done something no other nation had achieved. They had committed to equipping every infantryman, not just elite units, but every cook, clerk, and rifleman, with a semi-automatic battle rifle. While the Germans were refining their machine gun tactics and the British were drilling rapid-fire techniques with their bolt-action Lee Enfields, the factories in America were roaring to life. The vision of John Garand had survived the budget cuts, the caliber changes, and the doubts of the generals. The weapon was ready. It was heavy. It was loud. And it was hungry for ammunition. But it was a masterpiece of American persistence. The soldiers who were drafted in the wake of Pearl Harbor were handed this heavy wooden instrument and told it was their best friend. They did not yet know that the en-bloc clip Garand had designed to satisfy a bureaucratic requirement would produce a sound that would haunt their enemies. The stage was set for the collision between the old world's manual precision and the new world's semi-automatic fury. When American troops first clashed with the Wehrmacht in North Africa and Sicily, the German soldier was a product of supreme confidence. He was the conqueror of France, the master of the Blitzkrieg. His training emphasized individual initiative, tactical flexibility, and the absolute superiority of German weaponry. The average Lanzer, the German infantryman, looked at his equipment and saw the finest tools of war in existence. His uniform was smart, his machine gun, the MG-42, was a terrifying buzzsaw that ripped through the air at 1,200 rounds per minute, and his rifle, the Kar-98K, was a precision instrument with a heritage dating back to the glories of Prussia. From this high perch of martial arrogance, the first encounters with the American infantryman and his M1 Garand were viewed through a lens of contempt. The German perspective was deeply rooted in the doctrine of economy of force. To a German NCO, a soldier who fired rapidly was a soldier who was panicking. They believed that marksmanship was a deliberate act. Aim, breathe, squeeze. The semi-automatic nature of the American rifle was seen not as an advantage, but as a symptom of American weakness. "They need a machine to shoot for them," the German veterans joked in their dugouts. "They lack the discipline to make the first shot count." German snipers, in particular, felt this disdain keenly. These were men selected for their patience and their steady hands. To a sniper, the battlefield was a chessboard where silence and invisibility were the most powerful pieces. When they observed American patrols through their binoculars, they noted the heavy, bulky profile of the M1 Garand. They saw how American soldiers would sometimes fire 2 or 3 rounds in quick succession at a suspected target. To the sniper, this was amateurish. It revealed the shooter's position instantly. The German sniper believed that by the time the American had wasted his ammunition on the bushes, he could deliver a single, lethal round from his bolt-action Mauser. This illusion of weakness was reinforced by early engagements where inexperienced American troops, nervous and trigger-happy, did indeed burn through ammunition at an alarming rate. German intelligence reports from 1943 often characterized American infantry as material-heavy but tactically clumsy. They noted that U.S. units relied on overwhelming firepower to solve tactical problems rather than maneuver or precision. The German High Command read these reports and nodded. It confirmed their bias. The Americans were soft, spoiled by their industrial wealth, trying to buy victory with bullets rather than earning it with skill. But this arrogance blinded them to the reality of what was happening on the ground. The German soldier laughed at the rapid fire, calling it spray, until he found himself pinned behind a rock, unable to lift his head because the bullets kept coming. The German sniper mocked the wasted ammo, until he realized that the amateur American wasn't just shooting at bushes. He was suppressing the sniper's position so his squad mates could flank him. The laughter began to die in the throats of the Wehrmacht as the practical reality of fire superiority set in. The German doctrine relied heavily on the machine gun squad as the anchor of the defense. The riflemen were there to protect the machine gun. If the MG-42 was silenced or reloading, the German defense became vulnerable. The American doctrine, empowered by the Garand, was different. Every single rifleman was a base of fire. If the American machine gunner went down, the rest of the squad could maintain a devastating volume of fire with their rifles alone. The Germans were not prepared for this resilience. They would suppress a U.S. machine gun nest, expecting the incoming fire to slacken, only to be met with a renewed hail of 30 Arrow 6 rounds from 8 different directions. There was also a psychological component to the German dismissal of the Garand. It was a defense mechanism. By 1944, the German soldier was often fighting with limited supplies. His rations were meager, his transport was increasingly horse-drawn as fuel ran dry, and his air support was non-existent. To admit that the enemy also had a superior standard-issue rifle was to admit that the war was truly lost. So, they clung to the myth of the Mauser's superiority. They told themselves that the bolt-action rifle was the weapon of the true marksman, while the semi-automatic was a toy for the undisciplined masses. This hubris led to fatal tactical errors. German patrols would often engage American units at ranges where they believed their bolt-action precision gave them the edge. They would fire and then attempt to maneuver, assuming the Americans would be slow to react or suppressed by the initial volley. Instead, they found that the American return fire was instantaneous and sustained. An American soldier who missed his first shot could correct his aim and fire again in a split second. The German soldier, struggling to cycle his bolt while under fire, found that the window of opportunity had slammed shut. The laughter of the German snipers was the laughter of men watching a tsunami and mistaking it for a rising tide. They saw the water receding and thought they were safe, not understanding the wave that was building on the horizon. They mocked the ping of the clips and the heavy wooden stocks, unaware that they were facing the first modern infantry army. The M1 Garand was not a crutch for the weak. It was a hammer for the strong. And as the war ground on, the German soldiers' derision would turn into a grudging, terrified respect for the weapon that never seemed to stop firing. The illusion of American weakness was shattered not by propaganda, but by the relentless, rhythmic cracking of hundreds of semi-automatic rifles echoing through the valleys of Europe. Amid the cacophony of battle, the thumping of mortars, the ripping tear of the MG-42, and the deep boom of artillery, there emerged a sound that was unique to the American lines. It was a sharp, high-pitched, metallic ping. To the uninitiated, it might have sounded like a trivial mechanical quirk, a bit of debris striking a helmet. But to the men fighting for their lives in the hedgerows and forests, it was a signal as clear as a bell tolling. This sound was the birth cry of the empty M1 Garand, the auditory signature of the en-bloc clip ejecting from the rifle's receiver. The mechanics of this sound were simple. When the American soldier fired the eighth and final round from his clip, the rifle's operating rod locked back, and the empty spring steel clip was forcibly ejected upwards and out of the gun. It struck the receiver on its way out, resonating with a distinct ringing note that could cut through the ambient noise of a firefight. For the American GI, this sound was a mixed blessing. It was a confirmation that his weapon was clear and ready to be reloaded. It was a rhythmic punctuation mark to his engagement. But for the enemy listening in the lull of a close-quarter skirmish, it was interpreted as something else entirely. An opportunity. German veterans, whose ears were attuned to the mechanical rhythms of war, quickly learned to identify this sound. The ping became a siren song of vulnerability. In the close-range battles of urban Italy or the dense forests of the Ardennes, distances were measured in feet, not yards. At such close quarters, the sound of an empty weapon was a critical piece of intelligence. A German soldier crouching behind a wall pinned down by American fire would listen intently. Crack, crack, crack. He would count the shots if he could, but in the chaos, counting was difficult. The ping, however, was unmistakable. It signaled a definitive break in the wall of fire. The German soldier knew that for the next few seconds the American was defenseless. He had to reach to his cartridge belt, pull out a fresh clip, align it with the receiver, and shove it down until the bolt snapped forward. It was a process that, while fast for a trained soldier, still took time. Those precious seconds were the window the German needed. He could pop up from his cover, level his Kar 98K or MP40, and fire without fear of immediate retaliation. This auditory betrayal created a palpable tension for American troops. They knew the enemy was listening. Stories circulated in the foxholes, some perhaps apocryphal, others grimly real, of GIs who were rushed the moment their clips ejected. The ping became a psychological burden. It was a sound that announced to the world, "I am empty. I am reloading." In the stillness of a patrol gone wrong, that sound could feel louder than the gunshot itself. However, the German perception of this advantage was often exaggerated by their own desperation. They began to mythologize the ping. They convinced themselves that every time they heard it, a kill was guaranteed. It gave them a dangerous sense of tactical superiority. A German squad leader might hold his men back, waiting specifically for that metallic ring before ordering a charge. They believed they had cracked the code of the American weapon. They believed that the machine had a flaw, a fatal tell that leveled the playing field against the overwhelming volume of American fire. This belief led to moments of intense localized drama. Picture a ruined village in France. Dust hangs in the air. An American soldier is firing from a window, keeping a German fire team pinned in a doorway across the street. The Germans are huddled, unable to move. They wait. They listen. The American fires his last round. Ping. The sound echoes off the stone walls. The German NCO barks a command. "Jetzt! Now!" Two German soldiers break cover, sprinting across the street, weapons raised, convinced their adversary is fumbling with a fresh clip. They are driven by the certainty of the sound. They are driven by the belief that technology has betrayed the American. But war is rarely so simple. The ping was indeed a signal, but it was a signal that existed within the broader context of the squad. The German focus on the individual rifleman's reload status ignored the reality of American tactics. The lone GI might be reloading, but his buddy 3 feet away was not. The German soldier who charged the ping often found that while one rifle was silent, 3 others were waiting to speak. Yet the legend of the ping persisted. It became part of the folklore of the Wehrmacht. It was a small comfort they clung to, a belief that the American juggernaut had an Achilles heel. They listened for it with the intensity of a predator listening for a twig snap. They did not realize that their obsession with this single sound was narrowing their tactical vision. They were listening for a mechanical trigger, focusing on the micro moment of a reload, while the macro reality of the battle was shifting against them. The ping was real, and it was dangerous, but it was about to be weaponized in a way the Germans never expected. The very arrogance that made them laugh at the Garand's complexity was about to lead them into a trap of their own making. The sound they thought was their salvation would soon become the bait for their destruction. Adaptation is the currency of survival in war, and the American GI was nothing if not adaptable. As the war progressed and the stories of Germans rushing the ping filtered through the ranks, the initial anxiety about the sound transformed into a grim ingenuity. American soldiers, tired of being hunted during their most vulnerable moments, realized that the German obsession with the ejection sound was a predictable behavior. And in warfare, predictable behavior is a weakness waiting to be exploited. The tactic was simple, brutal, and required nerves of steel. It became known as baiting the ping. An American soldier, huddled in a foxhole or crouched behind a stone wall, would wait for a lull in the firefight. He would have a fully loaded M1 Garand in his hands, but he would also have an empty en-bloc clip, perhaps one he had pocketed earlier, resting within easy reach. The plan required perfect timing. The soldier would take the loose empty clip and throw it hard against a rock, his helmet, or the receiver of his gun. Ping. The sound was indistinguishable from the real thing. To the German soldiers waiting tensely on the other side of the hedgerow or down the hallway, the signal was clear. Their enemy was empty. The conditioning they had developed, the arrogance that told them the American weapon was flawed, kicked in instantly. They believed the window of opportunity had opened. "He's dry! Get him!" A German soldier, or perhaps a pair, would break cover, surging forward with the confidence of men attacking a defenseless target. They expected to see a panicked American fumbling to shove a fresh clip into his receiver. Instead, as they rounded the corner or popped up from the grass, they found themselves staring down the black barrel of a loaded M1 Garand. The American soldier hadn't fired a single shot to empty his weapon. He was waiting, finger on the trigger, with 8 rounds of .30-06 ready to fly. The result was devastating. The German attackers, caught in the open and off balance, were cut down before they could even raise their rifles. The trap turned their own tactical doctrine against them. The ping, which they had laughed at as a sign of American inferiority, had become the lure that drew them to their deaths. This tactic was not in any manual. It wasn't taught at boot camp in Fort Benning. It was a grassroots innovation, born in the mud and blood of the front lines. It spread from squad to squad, whispered in dugouts and shared over rations. "If you think Jerry is listening," the veterans would tell the replacements, "give him something to hear." The psychological impact on the German forces was profound. Imagine the confusion of a Wehrmacht unit that had lost men to this ruse. They heard the sound they were trained to exploit. They attacked as doctrine dictated, and they were slaughtered. The certainty of the battlefield began to erode. Suddenly, the ping was no longer a guarantee of safety. Was the American really reloading? Or was he waiting? The hesitation that this doubt introduced was lethal. In a firefight, a second of hesitation is an eternity. A German soldier who paused to wonder if the sound was real was a soldier who wasn't shooting, allowing the Americans to seize the initiative. There were variations of this psychological warfare. Some American soldiers would fire only a few rounds and then manually eject a partially full clip to create the sound, sacrificing a few bullets to secure a kill. Others would work in pairs. One man would create the fake ping while his partner, positioned a few yards away with a Thompson or a bar, would wait to ambush the Germans who took the bait. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, played out in the ruins of European cities and the frozen forests of the Battle of the Bulge. This shift marked a turning point in the infantry war. The Germans could no longer rely on the technical characteristics of the enemy's weapon to dictate their tactics. The Americans had proven that they were not just relying on industrial might. They were cunning, resourceful warriors who could turn a mechanical liability into a psychological weapon. The laughter of the German snipers had been silenced, not just by volume of fire, but by the realization that they had underestimated the intellect of their enemy. The ping trick became a legend of the war, a testament to the soldier's ability to improvise. It highlighted the fundamental difference between the two armies. The German army was built on rigid adherence to a masterful doctrine. When the doctrine failed, they struggled. The American army was chaotic, loud, and often improvised, but it possessed a flexibility that the Germans could not match. The Germans listened for a machine to tell them what to do. The Americans used the machine to tell the Germans a lie. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, the ping was no longer a joke to the Wehrmacht. It was a sound of uncertainty, a ghost in the machine that made every reload a potential ambush. The hunter had become the hunted, lured out of his hiding place by a piece of stamped steel hitting a rock. The trap was sprung, and the jaws of the M1 Garand snapped shut. The duel between the lone sniper and the infantry squad is an ancient rhythm of war, but the M1 Garand fundamentally disrupted this balance. In the First World War, a single sniper could pin down an entire platoon for hours. Armed with a bolt-action rifle, he could fire, disappear, and wait for the enemy to expose themselves in an attempt to locate him. The return fire he faced was often sporadic, bolt-action rifles aiming at a fleeting shadow. But in the European theater of 1944, the mathematics of suppression had changed. The volume of fire that a standard American infantry unit could generate meant that the lone sniper was no longer the hunter. He was a target drowning in a sea of lead. Suppression is a tactical concept that is often misunderstood. It is not about hitting the enemy with every shot. It is about making the enemy afraid to move, afraid to look, afraid to return fire. When a German sniper took a shot at an American squad, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Walking fire or reconnaissance by fire became standard procedure. If a shot came from a hedgerow or a farmhouse window, every Garand in the squad turned toward that general direction. This was not the disciplined, single-shot return fire the Germans were used to. This was a torrent. 8 rounds from one rifle, 8 from another, 8 from a third. 24 rounds impacting the sniper's cover in seconds. The air around the German position would snap and hiss with bullets. Wood splintered. Brick dust exploded into the air, and leaves were shredded. The sniper, who relied on calm and precision, found his world disintegrating. He couldn't lift his head to acquire a new target. He couldn't cycle his bolt without risking a bullet to the face. The psychological pressure of that much incoming fire was immense. For the German soldier accustomed to the bolt-action Mauser, this was a terrifying asymmetry. To return fire, he had to perform a complex series of physical actions: lift, pull, push, lock, aim, fire. Each of those actions took time. The American soldier facing him just had to keep pulling the trigger. If the American missed, he had 7 more chances instantly available. If the German missed, he was dead before he could chamber a second round. This volume of fire changed the geometry of the battlefield. It allowed American troops to maneuver aggressively. While half the squad poured suppressive fire into the suspected enemy position, keeping the Germans' heads down, the other half could advance, flank, and close for the kill. The Germans found themselves paralyzed. Their doctrine, which relied on the machine gun to provide suppression, crumbled when every enemy rifleman acted like a light machine gun. German interrogation reports from captured soldiers reveal a deep sense of frustration with this dynamic. "We could not move," one prisoner remarked. "Every time we tried to look up, the dirt kicked into our eyes. They never stopped shooting." The term Material Schlacht, battle of material, was used derisively, implying the Americans were winning only because they had more bullets. But to the GI on the ground, it wasn't about waste. It was about survival. It was about using the tool in his hands to dictate the terms of the engagement. The impact on the German sniper was catastrophic. The sniper's duel, a romanticized notion of 2 marksmen hunting each other, rarely happened. Instead, the sniper fired once and was immediately engulfed by a firestorm. The M1 Garand allowed the average infantryman to engage targets that he couldn't even clearly see. By saturating a suspected area with fire, he could neutralize a threat without needing pinpoint accuracy. This area fire capability was something the bolt-action rifle simply could not provide effectively. Furthermore, the Garand's semi-automatic action allowed for rapid target transition. In an ambush, where multiple German soldiers might pop up simultaneously, an American soldier could engage 2 or 3 targets in the span of 2 seconds. Bang, 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 3 targets engaged. A German soldier with a Mauser in the same situation would fire once, cycle the bolt, and by then, the situation would have changed. Or he would be dead. This capability was particularly devastating during the German counterattacks. As the Wehrmacht launched desperate assaults to retake lost ground, their infantry would charge across open fields or through city streets. They ran into a wall of fire that did not waver. The pause to reload, that vulnerable moment the Germans hoped to exploit, was minimized by the sheer number of semi-automatic rifles firing out of sync. As one GI reloaded, 5 others were still firing. The wall of lead was continuous. The bolt-action precision of the Kar-98K was rendered obsolete, not because it wasn't accurate, it was, but because accuracy matters little when you cannot stick your head up to aim. The Garand forced the Germans into a defensive crouch from which they could not escape. It stripped them of their initiative. The laughter that had greeted the clumsy American rifle had been replaced by the deafening roar of its success. The lone gunman, the symbol of individual prowess, had been defeated by the industrial efficiency of semi-automatic mass fire. The battlefield no longer belonged to the one who shot the straightest. It belonged to the one who could shoot the fastest and keep shooting. As the Allied armies breached the borders of the Third Reich, the nature of the war transformed once again. The open fields of France gave way to the claustrophobic nightmare of urban combat and the dense, dark woods of the Hürtgen forest. This was Fortress Europe, the final hardened shell of the Nazi Empire. Here, the Wehrmacht had promised to make every house a fortress and every street a graveyard. They dug into the rubble of cities like Aachen, waiting in cellars and bombed out storefronts, clutching their weapons with the desperation of men who had nowhere left to run. But in these confined spaces, the tactical disparity between the bolt-action Mauser and the semi-automatic M1 Garand widened into a chasm. In the chaotic, swirling violence of street fighting, the engagement ranges dropped from hundreds of yards to mere feet. Combat became a series of sudden, violent spasms. A soldier turned a corner and came face to face with the enemy. In these split-second encounters, the bolt-action rifle was a death sentence. The German soldier, surprised in a hallway or an alley, had one chance. He had to raise his long, unwieldy Kar-98K, acquire a sight picture, and fire. If he missed, or if there were 2 Americans, he was dead. The mechanics of his weapon simply could not keep up with the speed of the engagement. The American GI, however, wielded a weapon perfectly suited for this brutality. The M1 Garand's semi-automatic action meant that he could fire from the hip if necessary, pumping rounds into a room or down a stairwell without ever losing his grip on the weapon. He could clear a room with a speed that terrified the defenders. American tactics in urban environments evolved to exploit this dominance. They moved in fire teams, flooding a street with lead. When they breached a building, they didn't just enter, they assaulted with a wall of fire. The ping of the clip, once a liability, was now lost in the deafening roar of relentless close-quarters combat. The German defensive doctrine, which relied heavily on establishing kill zones with machine guns, began to disintegrate. In the ruins of a city, fixed machine gun positions were easily flanked or bypassed. The defense then fell to the individual riflemen scattered throughout the rubble. But a squad of Germans armed with bolt-action rifles could not generate the volume of fire necessary to stop an American assault squad armed with Garands. The Americans could suppress the German windows while simultaneously rushing the door. The Wehrmacht soldiers found themselves pinned, unable to return fire effectively, waiting for the inevitable grenade or burst of gunfire that would end their war. This unrelenting pressure broke the spirit of the defenders. German accounts from the Battle of Aachen describe a feeling of helplessness. They wrote of the automatic steamroller that crushed their positions. They noted that the Americans seemed to have endless ammunition and guns that never stopped firing. The psychological toll of facing a semi-automatic enemy in close quarters cannot be overstated. Every time a German popped up to fire, he faced a barrage. Every time he tried to move, the air around him filled with snapping bullets. The cognitive load of operating a manual bolt while under such intense stress led to errors, short-stroking the bolt, fumbling cartridges, jamming the action. The American soldier, under the same stress, simply kept squeezing the trigger. Even as the Germans began to field their own advanced weapons, such as the STG-44 assault rifle, it was too little, too late. The STG-44 was a formidable weapon, superior in many ways to the Garand, but it was rare. For every German soldier lucky enough to carry one, there were 50 holding a bolt-action Mauser or a desperate Panzerfaust. They faced a sea of olive drab, every single man armed with a semi-automatic rifle that punched through brick and wood with the heavy .30-06 round. The industrial disparity was now visible in every firefight. The German army was a patchwork of high-tech prototypes and obsolete relics. The American army was a standardized machine of destruction. The advance through Germany was a grind, a bloody attrition that chewed up men and machines. Yet the tempo of the American advance was sustained by the confidence the soldiers had in their rifles. They knew that in a one-on-one fight they had the advantage. They knew that if they were ambushed, they could respond with immediate, overwhelming force. This confidence fueled the aggression required to take city after city. They did not hesitate at the door. They kicked it in. They did not wait for the tank. They cleared the street themselves. The final battles of the war saw the Wehrmacht scraping the bottom of the barrel. The Volkssturm, the people's militia of old men and young boys, were thrown into the line, often armed with whatever rifles could be scavenged. Against these tragic, ill-equipped defenders, the M1 Garand was merciless. The disparity was no longer just tactical. It was a slaughter. The rhythmic cracking of American rifles echoed through the shattered streets of the fatherland, a constant reminder of the encroaching end. The German sniper, once the predator of the hedgerows, was now a hunted fugitive in the ruins of his own home. He had laughed at the American rifle in 1943. Now, in 1945, he cowered in a cellar as the ping of the ejection clips signaled the arrival of the victors. The fortress Europe, built on the myth of Aryan superiority and Prussian discipline, was being dismantled, brick by brick, by the sons of farmers and factory workers wielding the mass-produced genius of John Garand. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe in May of 1945, The landscape was littered with the detritus of a fallen empire. In the muddy fields of Bavaria and the shattered plazas of Berlin, immense piles of surrendered weaponry grew like monuments to defeat. Among them, stacked like cords of firewood, were millions of Mauser Kar 98K rifles. These weapons, once the pride of the Wehrmacht and the symbol of German martial tradition, now looked ancient. They were relics of a bygone era, discarded by men who had realized too late that the age of the bolt-action rifle had passed. Standing over these piles were the victors, the American GIs, their M1 Garands slung over their shoulders. The contrast was stark and undeniable. One weapon represented the pinnacle of 19th-century craftsmanship. The other was the herald of the modern age. The victory of the Allied forces was not merely a triumph of strategy or manpower, it was a vindication of a philosophy. The United States had wagered its industrial soul on the belief that the individual infantryman deserved the most advanced firepower available. They believed that a rifle should not just be a tool for marksmanship, but an engine of suppression. The skeptics, who had argued that the semi-automatic mechanism was too fragile, too wasteful, or too complex, had been silenced by the overwhelming evidence of the battlefield. The M1 Garand had endured the freezing mud of the Bulge, the salt spray of the Pacific, and the grit of North Africa. It had not just survived, it had dominated. General George S. Patton, a man not prone to hyperbole when it came to the tools of his trade, famously called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. This was not just praise for a piece of machinery, it was an acknowledgement of how the rifle had fundamentally changed the nature of combat. It had empowered the individual soldier. It gave the scared 19-year-old draftee the confidence that he could hold his ground against seasoned veterans. It allowed squads to move with a fluidity and aggression that the rigid German doctrine could not counter. The Garand had democratized firepower, putting the capability of a light machine gun into the hands of every rifleman. The end of the war marked the definitive death of the bolt-action rifle as a standard-issue military arm. The lesson taught by the ping and the relentless volume of American fire had been learned by the rest of the world. In the ashes of the conflict, every major power rushed to develop their own semi-automatic or automatic rifles. The Soviet Union, having seen the efficacy of mass firepower, accelerated the development of the SKS, and, soon after, the AK-47. The British bid farewell to their beloved Lee Enfields, moving toward the semi-automatic FNFAL. The world that emerged from 1945 was one where the rhythmic cycling of a bolt was no longer the heartbeat of the infantry. It was an anachronism, relegated to the realms of hunting and specialized precision sniping. For the German soldiers who survived the camps and the long march home, the memory of the Garand remained a bitter scar. They remembered the frustration of being pinned down, the helplessness of facing a weapon that never seemed to reload. The arrogance of 1941. The laughter directed at the heavy American club had evaporated. In its place was a solemn respect for the industrial giant that had crushed them. They had worshipped the precision of the single shot, failing to understand that in the modern maelstrom of war, quantity has a quality all its own. The sniper's laugh had been the hubris of the old world confronting the new. John Garand, The humble immigrant who had fought the Ordnance Department for decades saw his life's work validated on a global scale. He had given his country an edge that could be measured in lives saved and ground taken. He had designed a weapon that was imperfect. It was heavy, the clips were finicky, and it bit the thumbs of the careless. But it was exactly what the moment in history demanded. It was a rugged, reliable sledgehammer of a gun that broke the back of the Wehrmacht's resistance. As the American troops boarded the transport ships to go home, they carried the memory of that distinct sound with them. The ping was no longer a tactical liability or a signal for the enemy to attack. It had become the punctuation mark of their survival. It was the sound of a firefight ending, of a threat neutralized, of a job done. It was the sound that had rung out from the beaches of Normandy to the eagle's nest, a metallic chime that announced the liberation of a continent. The era of the bolt-action rifle had ended, buried under the weight of American steel and the relentless, semi-automatic cadence of the M1 Garand. The story of the M1 Garand and the German Mauser is more than a comparison of two rifles. It is a parable of the Second World War itself. It is the story of tradition colliding with innovation, of craftsmanship overwhelmed by mass production, and of arrogance humbled by reality. The German military machine, obsessed with the perfection of the individual warrior and his weapon, failed to see that the future of warfare lay in the collective power of volume and logistics. They laughed at what they did not understand, and by the time the laughter stopped, the war was lost. The M1 Garand stands today not just as a collector's piece or a museum exhibit, but as a symbol of the American spirit in that defining century. It represents the ingenuity to solve impossible problems and the industrial might to turn those solutions into victory. When we hear that distinctive ping today, we are hearing the echo of the men who carried that weight across a burning world. It was the sound that doomed the sniper, broke the Wehrmacht, and rang in the freedom we enjoy today. And that is why these tales must be told.